Okay, the second issue with this conception of race as biology is that there tends to be more genetic variation within quote unquote races as opposed to between them. And if you've taken a statistics course, you know that if you have a wide variation within a particular group or category, that's a pretty good indication that that group or category is not that distinctive. All right. To talk about a group in an analytical sense, you generally want to talk about people that share a number of characteristics, and so there isn't a wide variation. The fact that within our groupings of race there is tons of variation, again, is a pretty good indicator that we're not talking about distinct groups. And so one implication of this is that racial categories tend to be too general in that different groups or subgroups tend to be lumped together, but these different groups can be very different and distinct from one another. And we can see this in a number of ways. One is we can explore this question of where does the word Caucasian come from? White people, white folk are generally referred to as Caucasian. So where does that term come from and what is it in reference to? Well, if you've learned about this before, you know Caucasian comes from the word Caucasus, as in Caucasus Mountains. And the Caucasus Mountains are here, right along the border of the country of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and then up here is Russia. And this term is used, at least historically has been used, to refer to people who are stereotypically very white and almost Nordic in appearance, light skin, light hair, light eyes. However, the people who live around the Caucasus area tend to have darker features than this. All right, tend to have dark hair, a little bit more olive complexion, dark eyes, and things like that. So this word Caucasian, right, is supposed to kind of refer to this kind of like narrow category of whiteness, but it actually encompasses a really broad range of people. And again, that's a pretty good indicator that it's not a distinctive group. And so if we look at some kind of variations within white folk or Caucasian, we can see there's quite a bit. So here I was pulled pictures from like Miss World competitions. And we can see variation here. You know, if we look at hair color, blonde, red, you know, and dark brunette. And so within this group of white folk, right, not all white folk look alike. There is a lot of variation. The same is true if you look at populations over in Africa. Right, we can assume that all black folk are similar, but there's actually a wide range of variation of people that we consider, at least in the US, to be black. So, and then here are some examples. So we have the Twa, right, which we learned from the fish reading, tend to be very short in stature. And the reason for that is this is an ideal body size if you live in a very dense jungle. You're much more likely to get, it's easier to get through the environment. You're likely to get through it without getting cuts, which could become affected. Then we also have the Hutu and the Tutsi. And if you know anything about African history, you know that there was an attempt by the Hutu to ethnically cleanse the Tutsi. So there was a case of genocide over in Rwanda, where the Hutu was the majority population and the Tutsi was the minority population. So there's been tensions between these groups. But we can also see, right, there's some differences in appearance. Tutsis in general tend to be taller, a little bit lighter skin. Hutu tend to be a little bit shorter, a little bit darker skin. And if we think about our category in the US of Asian, that tends to lump together in a whole bunch of very different populations into all one group. So here is someone from, I believe, Pakistan. All right, here is someone from India, Korea, Mongolia, and Tibet. given the US category of Asian, right, all these people would be part of the same race and racial category, but we can see there's a wide variation in terms of physical appearance in these populations. And the history of the category of Asian in the US is interesting because when people were starting to think about how to officially classify different races, when they got to Asia, they didn't really know how to do it in a very sophisticated way. So they just kind of lumped everyone in together. All right, so our category of Asian, there's geographic similarity. Right, it refers to a different part of the world, but it overlooks the amount of variation we see within that geographic population. And so our racial category of Asian doesn't do justice to these differences that we see. All right, another implication with our category of race and the fact that there tends to be more variation within groups as between them is that not only are our categories too general, they're also too specific, and that it ignores variations within racial groups and categories. And if you have a group that's either too specific or too general, that's bad on its own. But if it's both too general and too specific simultaneously, that's a really good indicator that you don't have a very good and distinct group that you're referring to. All right, and so what do I mean by this idea that there are racial categories that ignores variation within races? Well, one way to look at this are results for the Boston Marathon, which tend to be pretty typical for other marathon races. And if you look at the top people who placed, you see that people from Kenya and Ethiopia are really highly represented in these races, and that tends to be true across the board in terms of long distance racing. And if we look at a map, we see that the group that tends to dominate long distance running competitions are populations from this general area. But within the populations of Kenya and Ethiopia, it's actually a subgroup of the population from these areas that tends to dominate long distance running. And I believe you pronounce it Kalenjin. People who are of Kalenjin ancestry only represent about 0.001% of the world's population, but they've won about 70% of Olympic medals in these middle to long distance running. Okay, so they are a very tiny population in terms of world standards, but they dominate in these middle and long distance runnings. And if my understanding is correct, and people who have done research on this say there's a couple of factors that play into giving people from this distinct population certain advantages when it comes to middle and long distance running. And if my understanding is correct, it's that this population traditionally comes from environments near sea level, but within the recent past, in terms of genetic time, so past few hundred years or so, they've moved to higher elevations. And what that means is that they're not naturally suited to living in higher elevations where there's less oxygen. They're more genetically suited to living in lower elevations where there is more oxygen, which means that their bodies have to learn to absorb more oxygen into the blood while living at this higher elevation. And that gives them an advantage then in terms of getting oxygen into their blood, which is an important factor when you're doing cardiovascular exercise. And also, if I understand correctly, the way that their calf is positioned on their leg, it tends to be higher up, also gives runners an advantage, because if you want to carry weight on your body when you're running, you want to carry it closer to your center of gravity. The worst place you can carry weight is down at the bottom of your leg, because that has to move the most, and it becomes more taxing the heavier it is. So the fact that their calves tend to be positioned higher up on their leg gives them an advantage when you're running, 10, 15, 20, 30 miles. So this small population within Kenya and Ethiopia tends to dominate long distance running. But if you were to take the average person from the society and pit them against the average person from any other society around the world, they're likely to just be equally fast and equally slow, which is another way of saying that for the most part, the people who are part of this population are broadly the same as everyone else that you would find in the world in terms of their athletic ability. But it's only at the very elite level, like the Olympic level, where very minute differences between people can matter in terms of where you place. And so this population has a few very slight advantages, but in situations where every second counts, the small differences give them an advantage. All right. So, yes, they have these small advantages, but that doesn't mean that everyone within this population is inherently fast. And if we look back here, we can see that, yes, people from Kenya and Ethiopia are dominating these races. But if you look further down in terms of where people place, you're going to see lots of people from the US and other countries. All right. And they're going to be pretty close to where these people finish. But when we see that the differences in terms of time and these top placements are a matter of minutes, having your calf be a couple centimeters higher up on your leg can matter in these kind of really elite settings. So there's only a small difference between the elite people in this group versus the elite people in any other population around the world. But those small differences can matter in these very competitive environments.